welcome to the House of ZK Radio, which is a focused podcast and media channel exploring everything ZK, zero knowledge. I'm Alice, I'm host of House of ZK Radio. Today I'm joined here with co-host Pavel from House of ZK and our guest, Aryan, who is head of research at CMT Digital. I'm personally very excited for this episode. Typically, for House of ZK, we interview lots of founders of projects, either working on ZK infra or integrating with ZK. But it's really great to hear from the other side of the table, from the venture side. So I'm personally very excited for this episode. And thank you so much, Aryan, for joining.
I'm excited as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering if we can first start off with just some insights about your journey into the Web3 space and how you specifically focused in research and venture. And also wanted to hear more about, like, in your current role, how you balance both the research side with technical depth, with market foresight, or keeping up with those current market trends.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in the crypto space since about 2017. Since I was a freshman at Columbia, I was studying economics and mathematics, and I took an interest in mechanism design for consensus mechanisms. Around the ICO era, consensus mechanisms was definitely a area for experimentation, so that was an interesting area for me to conduct one of my first research projects. That was a paper for governance mechanism design that was published with the Blockchain Research Institute, and then I also published a decentralized finance overview with them as well. Co-founded the Columbia Blockchain Club back in the fall of 2017, and joined CMT after I graduated. When we're looking at kind of balancing research and venture, I think it's definitely a bit of a flywheel, because you see the research kind of guiding the theses on the venture side, which then guide the research areas, and so it's a bit of a self-fulfilling flywheel in that sense. And yeah, I definitely find it helpful to engage in research for the topics that we're kind of all looking at in the space, and I think that in and of itself can help you identify what you want to structure your thesis on for a specific area before talking to companies. It always helps with coming to the table with some more context and questions that you want to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to hear that you first started in kind of more the research side when you were looking at mechanism design, and also published some DeFi related papers. But it's really great that you also mentioned that there is this self-fulfilling flywheel between research and venture, and kind of like how one is needed for the other, and using that to guide what you want your thesis to be structured on. Just on the topic for theses, I'm wondering, are there any particular core theses or research verticals that the venture or you are exploring right now? Any kinds of priorities that the team has?
Well, I mean, right now I'm spending a lot of time looking at kind of the future of Ethereum, somewhat outside of the normal research cadence. The future of Ethereum research piece has really been spurred on by a lack of direction, kind of lack of clarity in terms of direction moving forward for the Ethereum ecosystem generally. And I'm pretty optimistic about what Ethereum can be in the future, and I think that's part of the reason I wanted to do this research, to kind of showcase what I think some of those opportunities are for Ethereum. But I mean, that's a bit of a one-off type of engagement. Typically, in terms of the areas of interest, we've got a number, things like verifiability in trustless systems, I think is a broad area that we're interested in. Obviously, we see that extend to things like AI and crypto, verifiable inference, AI native coordination. A lot of that does tend to be a bit of a zeitgeist, just because there's so many different directions that AI can move, or the collaboration between blockchain systems and AI can move forward. So I think there's some lack of clarity there, which makes it difficult to engage fully. But typically incentive mechanisms and then how they relate to the products, whether it be things like programmable privacy, whether it be things like chain abstraction. I think the promise of blockchain is always rooted in the alignment of those incentives underneath.
Yeah, incentive alignment is definitely, I think, like a very key model that any kind of area in Web3 and even in like ZK as well, having that incentive alignment and having those appropriate incentive structures to make sure that all participants are having their fair distribution of rewards, are having proper alignment in order to participate and say if it's a network. So that's a really great point that you mentioned. And it seems like right now from what you say, right now your focus is looking at the future of Ethereum, but you're also looking around in the verifiability of trustless systems, in the crypto and AI intersection, like with AI native coordination. So it looks like a bunch of different diverse areas there.
Yeah, and I think the future of Ethereum piece would link back a lot to ZK as well, just because I think a lot of the future of Ethereum, especially at a L1 level, is very much rooted within ZK systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Ethereum Foundation itself is pouring billions of funding into ZK research. So whether that be with formal verification or with they're also looking into hardware acceleration, and even with their ETH Proofs initiative, trying to go towards real time proving. That's definitely a big focus that the EF has, and then also the broader Ethereum ecosystem. And Ethereum's 10-year anniversary is coming up as well. So very excited to see any kinds of like new shifts that we'll have. And yeah, Aryan, just very curious to hear, just on the like venture side, how do crypto native venture firms like CMT Digital differentiate compared to those traditional venture firms when it comes to supporting? I believe you guys have a heavy focus in early stage startups, and also even for things, for example, decentralized fundraising models versus traditional funding rounds. Are there any kinds of differentiators that maybe anyone in the audience who's curious to learn about, that these crypto native venture firms have compared to these traditional firms?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a little bit of background for us here at CMT Digital. We've been crypto native since, I would say, 2013, since our involvement with the Blockchain Association. I think we made initial investments around 2015, and we've been investing as an RIA, since 2017, 18. So we've been crypto native since 17, 18. I think in terms of the background of the firm, it's part of a trading firm that's been around for over 25 years. And so that sort of trading DNA is deep within the firm as well. And I think that speaks to some of the ways that we partner with our portfolio founders early. But typically what I think really sets us apart is the fact that we try to build conviction as early as we can, and to partner and invest as early as we can, often before testnets or products have even been created. And I think part of the reason that we feel comfortable doing that is because of the deep technical team that we have here. We do like to run nodes, we do like to test protocols and participate in early design kind of mental models. And our investment activity is really driven by our theses. And so we try to study these primitives and extrapolate trajectories. Often the theory is easier than the practice, but the theory behind that sort of engagement is changing the role of a VC in this crypto native environment from being purely just a capital allocator, where the avenues by which you can raise capital is increasing in this environment. I mean, as you mentioned, things like the coin list, things like these platforms where you can raise capital. It's not just about the capital allocation, it's about also being a technical validation layer or a product kind of go-to-market validation partner. And so through our work in supporting things like DAOs, open source contributions. I think that's something that requires more than just cap tables, but it requires kind of the context of this environment. And I think that's where being crypto native really helps.
I guess on that point of being crypto native, like what are the some of the when projects come and let's say need assistance, where do you think is like the key areas where projects typically would require, like if they come in with like an idea, how do you help flesh out that vision to something that's practical, or what kind of assistance do projects typically require when looking for the help?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, I mean, it starts out at the validation stage, and it can be validating either the go-to-market, it can be validating the technical setup. But a lot of the time, the founder is building this obviously from the ground up, and they're going to have a million different questions about different choices that they can be making, whether it pertains to their, key layer and their security layer. And they perhaps have a idea of the different routes that they can take in solving a certain problem at a certain point in the stack. And being able to validate those micro decisions at the very early level with someone who has seen that sort of decision process play out hundreds of times, I think we found to be helpful, because we can offer solutions that they may not have considered, just as a function of how many different teams solving how many different problems we've encountered. And that's where the network can come in, and the traditional sort of introductions and access to the network can be helpful. But in the actual product piece, I think being able to validate that the product direction is in line with kind of the thesis, and then if they need, helping them with some of those mechanism design choices is something that we like to do early. So I've done things like helping create order matching engines, or helping talk through token design models, and helping kind of validate that the hardware is trivial to run as an independent hardware operator. So those sort of earlier engagement type opportunities where it may not necessarily move the puck in and of itself, we found that those are interesting and low friction ways that we can get involved and help our portfolio founders early. And yeah, we hope that it's appreciated and it's actually helping them.
Yeah, and it's really those like micro decisions that compound and that really help fuel that, validation stage that you mentioned about. And I really liked that point earlier that you made, that kind of your role is not just about capital allocation, but you guys also function as say like a product validation partner, or even helping helping teams drive towards their longer term visions, which can especially be challenging when teams are first building out in the early stage. So really great to hear kind of the role that venture has, beyond just capital, and how big of how diverse they can play in these startups. But very curious to also hear if there's any kinds of like critical metrics or signals that you look for, and maybe startup founders should also look for when evaluating whether a project, it could be like a ZK project or just a general crypto project, is reaching product market fit. And I know that you mentioned that you have invested in projects that have like been before the actual product is created, or even before testnet. And at that time, you're participating in early design mental models, you're participating in those test protocols. But very curious to hear if there's any sort of metrics that you look for when seeing if a project has reached PMF.
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer this for ZK specific, and obviously it will be applicable for general projects as well. But given this is House of ZK, I'm happy to kind of tailor it for ZK projects specifically. I think with ZK, one of the core filters I look for is like displacement. So sort of what sort of trust assumption is this replacing? And this can be a trust assumption that exists in the context of a institution or a company that has been kind of taking this position of a trusted entity within some sort of structure. So for example, credit underwriting, we have certain trusted authorities in the credit underwriting space that, attest to your credit score. That's what I mean by saying trust assumption. It's not necessarily something within systems design. It's just a trust assumption that exists within some sort of framework. I think that's especially important for zk projects. I think also when you look at, architectural setup, sort of integration depth, and its ability to exist in a modular system, can this solution slot into multiple layers or chains or parts of the current way that it is done? So going back to the credit underwriting example, like can this slot into already existing frameworks for underwriting? I think there's also surface area, how far-reaching is this sort of solution and how composable is it for future builders and future parts of the stack that are going to be built on top of it. I think that's pretty important. And then finally, looking at things like scalability and escape velocity, just generally. Can this attract developers and users on its own? Does it create a flywheel? And so, in a way, our best investments end up looking like infra at the beginning and end up as platforms at the end, because they've created this environment where it is replacing a trust assumption. It's able to fit into many different areas, and it's able to be far-reaching in terms of its effect and impact, and it is able to scale independently of external kind of pushing.
I see. So some of the kind of main factors that you look at for ZK specific projects is first determining what kind of trust assumption is this replacing, its ease of integrations with, say, existing frameworks out there, the composability aspect for builders and for future parts of the stack, and then also with the scalability portion and creating that flywheel effect.
Yeah, and I think, there's a few, specifically within ZK, there's a few, I wouldn't say misconceptions, but things that we've seen in the past that I think we take a little bit of a different stance on. So, ZK is very technical, and a lot of the products that end up being made for ZK are very technically in depth and maybe not always intuitive for potential customers to understand. And so I think part of the equation for founders should be, this is valuable to use and not just this is hard to build, because there are many different challenges and in building something that is hard. That doesn't necessarily mean it's valuable. And in ZK, where there are no shortage of hard problems to solve, I think it's especially important to focus on something that is hard but also valuable. And a lot of the time, if it's hard and no one's built it before, it just might not be valuable. I also think people pitch ZK as privacy quite a lot, and that might have been helpful for telling the story early, but I think the value of ZK is far more than just privacy. It's the verifiability, and the privacy is just kind of like a side effect of the verifiability. And I do think that in ZK, PMF looks very different to the rest of crypto. PMF might mean usage in the rest of crypto, but I think PMF here really lies in whether or not someone's willing to pay for it, because the product is really trust, and in a way, no one's really willing to pay for trust yet. I think ZK would have found PMF once you have a clear customer who's willing to pay for that trust, whatever the product may be. It's not just selling speed; it's selling trust so that you don't have to ask for it in the future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And even on the topic of, privacy, a lot of users nowadays will sacrifice privacy for convenience. And that point that you mentioned that people really need to be willing to pay for it is, yeah, I definitely agree, is one of the most crucial factors. A lot of ZK projects now are really looking into reducing these proving costs as well. So we're seeing lots of different infra being built with proving networks and proving marketplaces as well. And also that point that you mentioned, that differentiating between if something is valuable versus if it's hard to build. Yeah, I definitely also agree with that. A lot of the times I feel like many projects like ZK projects, they have this shiny new tech, whether it be like a new proving system or a different type of cryptographic scheme that they're using. And that itself is very exciting, but it may come with its own trade-offs in implementation, especially if it's new. And at the end of the day, I think that we all need to remember that ZK and just tech in general is just a tool, not kind of the end solution or like some kind of cookie cutter solution that we can slap onto different problems. So it's really great that you mentioned these kinds of points. And just on the point relating to kind of like all of this infra that's being built, I feel like a lot of the talent and investment seems to be going towards, at least in the ZK space, to building this infra. So we have those proving networks, we have coprocessors, which I know, Aryan, you were looking into before, and ZK VMs right now, almost 30 exist in the market. So there's definitely a lot of development being made towards the infra side. But I'm curious to hear if you see anything missing on the application side. Do you think that we're at that point where we're ready to be building applications on top of this infra? Or do you think that we should still put more focus on building out this infra first?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think, yes, absolutely, infra is oversaturated. And I mean, there's a real reason for that. Infra is investable before the UX gain is proven, or before the need for the infra is proven. And it is theoretical, and that's why you see the founders kind of skewing academic or systemic in terms of their backgrounds. I think part of the reason that we're still building infra is the tooling is still very much nascent. I mean, we don't really have ZK native app frameworks, which I would see as like a bit of a precursor to having ZK applications really proliferate broadly. I mean, think like maybe a verifiable React or like ZK Rails. I think part of the reason that we're not seeing the applications yet is because we're not providing enough of a developed ecosystem to warrant kind of building fully fledged applications. I think application layer primitives also, there's a few that are common denominators across all applications, things like identity, things like historic proofs, like state witness proofs as well. A lot of those, there's fragmented standards and there's fragmented kind of approaches, and there's no one unified way of doing things. And so I still think we're waiting for winners to emerge on those infra choices before standards can emerge as well, and before there's kind of unified frameworks on which to move forward. I do think there are a lot of applications that present meaningful opportunities for us to improve the way that things are done. I mean, verifiable backend logic just comes to mind first and foremost. I mean, the whole point of blockchains is to move a lot of the backend processes to an environment that is verifiable. And so, why not have verifiable backend logic as an application, as a product? There's a lot of opportunity there, in my opinion.
Absolutely. So right now, we still need a lot of work towards making this tooling more accessible and also more unified as well. You mentioned that we have, at least for even for like the application layer primitives, there's a lot of different fragmented approaches, and we have the lack of this unified framework. And we have this need for, say, like, for example, a verifiable React or something that is, really familiar for developers. But in addition to this barrier relating to tooling and developer experience, are there any sort of other challenges that you see ZK facing that really prevent more mainstream adoption? Curious to also hear if there's any kinds of challenges that you saw when you first came into this space years ago that have been resolved now, or any kinds of new challenges that you are currently seeing that haven't really existed before.
I think the standards question is probably top of mind here for me. We're seeing so many different ZK VMs, for example, and Ethereum is talking about RISC-V and a future for RISC-V, and on the Ethereum DA sort of environment, it does seem like things are moving towards more of a ZK-based proving stack. I just don't know why there needs to be so much fragmentation and why there needs to be so many different ZK VM standards, especially if there's an environment on the Ethereum L1 where it's likely to be RISC-V based proving anyway. Why can't you then tailor your own sort of local environment proving stack for the end user and kind of wait for the ETH-L1 RISC-V environment to be somewhat generalizable in terms of what it can handle and what it can verify? And I feel like if you can onboard those users and tailor an environment that is really optimized for their use cases and for them to be able to onboard today, you can figure out how you want that trust to extend down to the ETH-L1 crypto economic level later, if that makes sense. And so I feel like there's a lot of building towards the theoretic optimal and not a lot of building towards kind of the pragmatic products that could exist today.
On that note, so right now there's been a lot of developments, or at least like the practical approaches have been noted with trusted execution environments, which is like a hardware set of trust. So I believe like Unichain is using it, and then there's like a few products like Phala that provide it. I guess like on that approach, like, would you think that having this sort of maybe like pre-ZK for that testing ground, or having like a combination of different tools may enhance maybe like either the functionality or security properties? What are your thoughts about having like different types of systems that although potentially redundant might offer maybe some level of advantages if in case of like vulnerabilities exist?
Definitely. And I would actually argue in a way that they're not necessarily redundant because they're not direct rivals of each other, and they kind of form a stack. So, I mean, TEEs, they're fast, they're off the shelf, they're really useful for kind of low latency applications. A lot of the prerequisites that ZK can't really provide right now, and MPC can't really provide either, to be honest. And so I think we're starting to see these emerging patterns where people are using TEEs for local compute, proving over them with ZK or with MPC to secure them, and then using ZK to bridge those kind of local environments to a kind of universal level of trust, to verifiable level at like a global blockchain level. So you would see this kind of composable trust stack start to emerge where you've got the runtime secured by TEEs, and network and logic can then all be cryptographically guaranteed using either a mixture of TEEs or ZK or MPC. The important thing is that TEEs are useful today sure, they have trust assumptions, and sure, you can kind of target them at an individual level with a side channel attack, but the point is that they're useful today, and if you combine them with proper mechanism design in terms of, how the TE is rotated or the security assumptions made on the data level, then I think that they can be useful in onboarding users whose problems are solved today using the stack that we have today. And then it positions that stack to transform into a generalizable privacy or validation stack if and when the technology becomes available to do so. And then we might see people moving off of TEE. But the important thing is that the trust assumptions within that stack don't change.
Got it. So you see it as not really kind of like a redundant security check, but rather a necessary component to building this composable trust stack.
Exactly, and maybe we move off of TEEs later, but I quite like TEEs, and they're making themselves more robust against kind of future innovations. I mean, in the way that they are thinking about passkeys and kind of attesting to outputs in an increasingly native way. I mean, we're seeing increasingly that TEEs can handle bigger and bigger workloads, or start to finish type workloads and attesting to everything within it. And I think that's stuff that is being optimized and wouldn't have existed if there wasn't a clear demand for it.
Absolutely. And I'm also just on the topic of TEs. I'm curious to hear about how you see their role fitting with zkTLS. I know that kind of one of your focuses was in data composability and kind of the role that zkTLS has in it. So right now, there's like quite a few different ways for using zkTLS via MPC or a proxy or TE as well. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the role of TEs for example, applications with zkTLS, and if you see, say, like one approach dominating just based on the research you've gathered so far.
Yeah, I mean, generally, I think that we're seeing TEs and zkTLS as being kind of converging standards and not competing standards, in the sense that TEs are providing this kind of fast runtime environment, but it does require that trusted hardware. And right now we're seeing that, what is it, Intel and ARM only, pretty much. zkTLS does provide those cryptographic proofs, and it eliminates the need for kind of trusting the endpoint here, or the hardware specifically, but it is that heavier computational load that is the gating factor here. And so we've got this environment where one side of the equation is already available. TEs are cheap, fast, and ready today. zkTLS is provably the right solution to partner with it, but it's slow for now. And so in the short term, I think we'd expect to see kind of TEE accelerated zkTLS proving. So, maybe instead of generating ZK proofs on the TLS handshake purely in software, we could offload parts of that handshake or key agreement logic into the TEE enclave and prove over the TEE's attested output. zkTLS could also slot in as an audit layer for the TEEs. So we could say, let the TEE handle the high throughput TLS kind of termination and use zkTLS to generate a periodic or challenged based response. And I think these sort of hybrid models in the interim will increase throughput, increase usability, without losing sight of that long-term goal of verifiability.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, really interesting that you mentioned that use case as zkTLS as an audit layer for TEs, and how we can anticipate, say, TE accelerate zkTLS proving in the future. I think it's very exciting that all of these different primitives can go hand in hand and come together. And just on the topic of some other kinds of layers of the stack or other types of methods for getting towards verifiability. I know that you were looking also into zk coprocessors as well. So curious to hear any types of use cases that you see are ideal to be integrated with coprocessors. And just on that topic before, on kind of like the lack of standardization that we see a lot with infra, like for example, with all of these zk VMs being developed, they all have slightly different design considerations, but at the end of the day, they're a zk VM. We can see something a bit similar with coprocessors as well. There's not as many zk coprocessors as zk VMs, but quite a lot of teams are building their own coprocessor design as well. So I'm curious to hear about your thoughts towards the standardization of coprocessors, why we see all these teams kind of building their own, and then also any types of use cases that you're personally excited to see being integrated with these coprocessors.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, generally, the bigger picture is that it's the coprocessors are going after the same thing. The shared goal is all the same, that they're trying to have an environment where you have this trust minimized compute access, but with kind of portable and composable proofs of correctness. zk VMs, I think they're really supposed to be kind of smart contract compatible natively, and it's supposed to be like a layer one type solution. Whereas zk coprocessors are supposed to be more of this general purpose kind of maybe lower scope type proof generating part of the stack, but it's not kind of as broad as zk VMs generally. And so I think it's important to notice or to note the scope of what the infrastructure piece is trying to do. They're all components of the same stack of verifiability. So what do we think coprocessors are good for? Well, we think they're really useful for combining some sort of process outside of crypto with the trust and the kind of incentive alignment mechanisms that crypto is good for, without losing granularity and while maintaining kind of the ability to be composable. And so things like AI inference, of course, prove that an ML model was executed correctly. But also things like MEV resistant auctions, like prove that some process was handled correctly without, leakage to some external system. Or it could be as generalizable as something like a gaming engine, prove that the physics engine was run correctly. Or in DeSci, we're seeing some use cases as well, like prove that this weather model was ran correctly, prove that this protein was folded correctly. So generally, I'd say coprocessors are these programmable truth machines where they let any system prove what it did without exposing it. But you're right, there is this fragmentation problem. And I think why this happened is pretty important, because it's understanding how we got here, but there was really zero coordination on standards during early evolution. And I think that's pretty standard with open source type environments. You have many different people working on the same sort of problem. Well, naturally, they're going to come to differing types of solutions. And so there's been a benchmark-driven culture as well when it comes to open source software. Every team is optimizing for their own speed, their own recursion or size, or depending on kind of what KPIs they're going after. And so there's no standard zkVM, and there's limited composability between these proofs as well. Firstly, I would say this is all natural and somewhat necessary early on. You really need to explore the full design space, and fragmentation signals this early experimentation. But I do think convergence is inevitable in the long run. zkWASM was starting to emerge as a bit of a standard earlier. I think when we start looking at like proof serialization formats like SnarkPack, or even things like cross-stack middleware, like maybe proof routers we start seeing, or zk indexes. I think that's what will start to drive some of the convergence. So it's this middleware that I expect, the zk middleware, to drive convergence. And the zk middleware will naturally be looking for users and demand. And so I think in a way it will be a naturally kind of solving problem, because the middleware will be optimizing for demand, which will then in turn be optimizing for the solutions that meet that demand best. And so all in all, I think coprocessors will be picked based on the verticals that they're aiming to solve for. Some will be optimized for zkML, others for client-side WASM, others for arithmetic-heavy logic. I expect to see kind of a modular mesh of coprocessors connected by shared DA. And it's this DA that I expect to drive the composability, because it's the point at which the settlement occurs. And I think it's the point at which the trust will be anchored to the incentive alignment that we see on blockchains.
So you see kind of like these coprocessors you mentioned as this modular mesh of composability that can be connected by DA, but at the same time, we need to consider that the shared goal is the same, and all of these are, whether it be coprocessors or zkVMs or other layers of that infra stack, they're all part of the same stack for verifiability. So I really like that, how you put it like that, and how we're all trying to go towards this shared goal. And, in terms of trying to go towards standardization, I really liked how you mentioned that one of the reasons why was because we didn't really have any kind of coordination on standards. And I really liked that point that you also mentioned about the benchmark driven culture as well for zkVMs. All of these zkVMs we see are optimizing on their own KPIs, and they also have limited composability with these proofs. But there is an opportunity you see with middleware for driving some more convergence. So many opportunities in that area, which I think is very exciting. And I also wanted to go into the topic of the role of zk in AI-based verifiability as well. I know you mentioned that like one use case with AI inference proving that some kind of model was executed correctly, but wanted to hear more about, since CMT Digital has a focus on the crypto and AI intersection. So curious to hear about any like opportunities that you see in when we're adding zk to that intersection as well. So perhaps it's like a AI, crypto, and zk related intersection. And if there are any types of near-term use cases or maybe promising longer-term use cases you see in that intersection, whether it be verifiability with AI inference or even, for example, detecting deepfakes. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on that intersection.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of this is probably where we have the least clarity. I mean, this topic, just because AI is moving so quickly, and the AI workloads are then naturally changing so quickly, which for zk-based systems is obviously not ideal. And so all of that to say that we can postulate all we want now, but it's very much anything can happen in this space. zk can be very useful for AI, or it can end up being not useful at all. That being said, I do think it will be useful. I mean, things like, one of the biggest problems that we have right now with AI is that it is a bit of a black box. And if you're thinking about the role of data, for example, within AI, there's a lot of controversy going around about kind of where the data was sourced for training of these kind of initial foundation models. Part of the problem with creating incentive mechanisms or a blockchain-based kind of data collection platform for data sharing for these AI training purposes is it's very hard to know if the data was used within training or not, and therefore it's really hard to actually value the data. This is one of the biggest problems within the data and crypto kind of AI overlap, is that it's very difficult to actually value that data and then reward it, commensurately or proportionally. And so things like zk proof of training data inclusion. Now, obviously, that from a compute perspective, that's not very, reasonable right now. You can barely have distributed compute that's going to be as performant as centralized compute. And so it's hard to think about verifiable inclusion of data within some training process at this point. But I think that would be really impactful, because then you would be able to value data at a much more granular level than you can today, and therefore have far better pricing for data rewards for a data kind of collection platform. I think that would be really, really encouraging to see. Timelines is obviously unsure. Obviously, agent verifiability, proving kind of the output to make sure that LLMs don't hallucinate, misbehave, or kind of act unpredictably in this way. But I think the long-term opportunity for zk and AI is in this kind of environment where you have one leaning on the other. So if we take the example of zk ML pipelines, like private inputs, public guarantees, if you want to apply some model to private data, for example, biometrics or healthcare data, financials, without leaking that data, I think this is one of those areas where we could see real demand for real applications in the short run. Running these models over encrypted or private inputs, and you would only really need zk here to prove that the output is valid under a certain model. And so a lot of the excitement for zk AI stems from one main kind of reality, in that the zk within AI flips the equation, in that you don't trust the model with your data, you prove that the model can respect your data. And I think that levels the playing field in a different way.
Absolutely. And especially as you mentioned, all of these models currently operate in these black box environments where we don't really know, for example, where the data is being sourced. So having the ability to provide proofs, say, of this data being included in training, or even other parts of that pipeline, would really be beneficial. But of course, as you mentioned, there's that need to consider, for example, cost and just the overall feasibility of including this. So
I think that
definitely
also,
see. Mhm.
sorry, I think it also answers one of our main questions of who pays for it, because verifiable inference is kind of like the Trojan horse. Like, we're selling verifiable inference, but what we're getting is provable alignment. You can prove whether or not something is aligned. Now, that can be with private data, of course. But it also answers the question of who pays for the trust, because then it becomes clear that there is an economic model for the proofs. If the proofs allow the model creator to get more users than it would otherwise, I think that answers the question of who pays for those proofs. So it's one of those areas where I think we see a ability and a willingness to pay for the proofs that perhaps the other environments are leaving a little bit more theoretical for now.
So we can see more demand, at least on the proof generation side, on that end. And I feel like this also ties into what a lot of zk prover networks and prover marketplaces are building towards, in terms of users being able to outsource their proofs to another network, as opposed to doing some client-side proving where they're just generating proofs locally. But wanted to hear some of your thoughts on those kinds of environments and how that plays into some economic models with, say, like who we can decide who pays for these proofs, and how we can ensure that any types of actors participating in these networks, like, for example, the provers and the end users, have incentive alignment. And I know that you were also looking into incentive mechanisms as kind of like a core theme for this year. So wanted to hear more about a point that you mentioned, I believe in an article that you wrote, just on like the role that zk plays in enabling this idea of a proof of compliance with current incentive mechanisms set in place. So just wanted to hear some of your thoughts relating to incentive mechanisms, both in like proof markets and proving networks, but then also this idea of a verifiable proof of compliance.
Yeah, I mean, the verifiable proof of compliance, let's talk about like who values the proof, who pays for the proof, because I think that gives us a clear cost that the proof can, be up to. And so, verifiability creates this economic value just so far that it can replace the trust overhead that existed beforehand. So if the introduction of verifiability saves money, i.e. the app developer doesn't need to pay for an audit log or a compliance check anymore, then that proof is worth that much. I think it's harder if it creates a new user experience. If the user doesn't have to use their email and password anymore, I think that's harder to value. But then, as a result, if it enables something like settlement and composability, that's also value that is harder to extrapolate and price as well. So generally, I think the base is kind of whatever you paid for before. Anything below that is a cost saving, and it's obviously good. It's not necessarily clear, though, who would pay what and where. At the app layer, should it be the end user, or should it be a B2B type fee? Should you pass those fees over to the end user? And that depends on if you do that now. Execution and settlement, I think this is where things become a little bit less clear. For execution and settlement, it's probably the app layer, the developer, or the relayer, if we're talking about sequences, but that's a little bit more of an open question. But the infra market and the more token-based cost models, I think that's where it's very much an open question, and very much within that proven marketplace type setup, and where we can get into kind of crypto economic security and guarantees. But that's a lot to do with the incentive alignment piece. And we can dive deeper into that if you want. Yeah, in terms of that marketplace, I think the biggest challenge there is the cost of externalization. How is that cost then passed downstream to protocols and networks? And I think this is where misalignment can really form. You obviously want the best product with the most verifiable stack, but are you willing to then pass those costs down? Is your user willing to bear those costs, or are you willing to pay those costs for a better application? There's also a chance that we start seeing cartelization of the prover environment. If proving becomes too centralized, if it becomes too hardware heavy, cartels could form, and they could then, seek rent. And with this marketplace example, we get back down to this core problem of mispriced trust. How do you price the trust? Not all proofs are equally verifiable. A 10-minute zkML proof for an AI emoji is not going to be worth the same as a DeFi fraud proof, for example. But gas-based pricing and compute doesn't care, and it doesn't capture that nuance. So verifiability is valuable, but the price of trust is not consistent across whatever is being proven. So I think the market-based proving is good because it creates this competitive marketplace whereby the laws of supply and demand can kind of figure this out. You could introduce things like reputation staking for provers and experiment with incentive alignment in that sense. And you can hope that kind of the free market games that play out there will result in the most optimal sort of environment. But there needs to be this reframing of proofs as an economic asset across the environment, because in this ZK world, proofs are not just outputs, they're also inputs in their products. They get routers, they get created, they get reused, they could even be traded. So having marketplaces for state root proofs, for example, I think is a necessary step to ending up with an environment that is optimal.
Got it. Yeah, lots of points over there. And it's really down to determining for like these proof marketplaces and proof networks how to price that trust, and then also determining who will bear that cost. If it's the end user, and then from there determining if they're willing to pay, or if it's the proof network itself who needs to play. Are they willing to bear the cost there? And yeah, I there's like a lot of different kinds of, I guess, design considerations that these marketplaces are making, whether it be with their slashing mechanism or if they have some of them have different auction models with some degree of randomness attached to further drive competition. But yeah, really great to hear how it really kind of boils down to those fundamental questions that these proving marketplaces and proving networks need to ask. So that's great to hear. And just as a last question before we close today's session, I'm curious to hear, Aryan, if you have any kind of advice or any pointers that you'd like to tell some founders in the audience. We do have some founders who are listening to this podcast. I know that you previously mentioned earlier on some misconceptions that some founders have, but also wanted to hear if you have any sort of takeaways or just general advice for founders who are currently either raising right now or looking to raise their next round.
Yeah, I did actually. I tried to put down 5 hard truths ahead of the session for founders around things that we think specifically help. So number one, I think proofs are not just features. A lot of the time we see founders talking about proofs as being kind of a feature of the product, but I think they're the core unlock. They are the product for these founders. Not just that they exist, but you should really build around the proofs, and specifically around what the proofs unlock. So if you have a product that unlocks something, that's good. That takes us to our second point, that yes, speed is important, but it's the composability with the unlock that wins. So if your proof unlocks something, making that unlock then composable with other things helps. Speed is a prerequisite, but it's not the be-all and end-all. You need to make sure that it's fast enough to be useful, but only fast enough that it's useful so that it can be used in that unlock, whatever the proof unlocks. So then the third point, don't just benchmark your prover, benchmark the value of that unlock. How much would this be valued? Who's willing to pay for this, and how much are they willing to pay as a result of this unlock? Answer that first. Number 4, verifiability without a UX increase is just an academic exercise. Make it verifiable, but make sure that the ZK components are somewhat invisible. I mean, the unlock is going to be felt. You don't need to show the ZK process as part of the UX, especially if it's just, added technical complexity. Your users can't tell you what a circuit is. They shouldn't be able to see it. And I'd say finally, in the prover wars, be the router, not the racket. So own the interface between the apps and the verifiability, not necessarily just the verifiability. owning kind of on what basis the verifiability is used is kind of key to scaling, in my opinion, because then you can spot the opportunities for added products in the future and kind of go where the puck is going.
Yeah, amazing. I think that's pretty solid, pretty concrete advice. So just as like a recap, there's that need to build around proofs. Proofs are not just a feature of a product, and composability that unlocks over speed, should be prioritized. And it's also important to benchmark the value of that unlock, and just on the UX side, making that process as seamless as possible, ideally making those ZK components invisible to the end user. And lastly, kind of being the router and being able to interface between these different apps and verifiability. Yeah, that's very great and solid advice. But yeah, thank you, Aryan, for joining us on today's episode. Yeah, really great to hear kind of your perspective. I feel like you give a very good first macro perspective of the overall industry, and then you also have very much in-depth insights about some of the verticals that you're looking for. So it's really great to hear those economic models for proofs, building towards the stack of verifiability with TEs, coprocessors, zkVMs, and your points on the middleware for the need for middleware for driving convergence, as well as in the end, the incentive models for these proving marketplaces. So all really great insights, and really enjoyed having you.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, love the questions as well. And thank you for everything you're doing in the ZK space, getting everyone up to speed. It's definitely not an easy challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We're trying to drive towards ZK education adoption, but everyone here is really trying to work towards the same goal.
We need a verifiable credential in ZK.
Yes, we do.
And a proof marketplace to go with it.
Yep.
That's right.
Yeah, thank you so much.